Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Biotech and Health Extension Group, sponsored by 100 Plus Capital. I'm super delighted to have Dean Ball here again. Dean is no stranger to our technical groups at this point and is one of the few people that we invite over to chime in on the more general meta innovation policy questions that are surrounding the technologies that many of you guys care about. So I'm really excited to have you here. I think you have a really sober mind screwed on when it comes to developing sensible frameworks for how to even think about the broader policy and innovation landscape around many of these technologies that's pretty reasonable and pragmatic while still allowing for lots of progress to occur. We just had the pleasure of seeing you in person, Puerto Rico, where you gave a fantastic talk that's going to be published soon if people want more. And we had you on in our neurotech group as well. But today you're joining us here to really discuss re-regulation, not deregulation, a 21st century framework for biotech policy in our biotech group. The stage is yours. Please take it away. I'm going to filter questions. So if you are here and are wanting to ask Dean, you can either raise your hand after he's done talking, or you can already start chiming in on the chat and have other people chat as well. That's usually pretty fun. Okay, go ahead. Thanks a lot for joining.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind intro. And by the way, let me know. Do feel free to interrupt me if my audio goes in and out. I'm working with a new microphone here. And so I don't know its characteristics, its sonic characteristics that well. But so my primary gig is AI policy. But one of the sort of fundamental theses that I have is that AI and related technologies, and increasingly I consider biotechnological advances to be related to AI, will fundamentally challenge a lot of regulatory frameworks that we have in the United States. I think that there's essentially not a single ideology that is compatible with strong AI. And I think that will also be true as biotechnical advances come. So my thesis here is that we have a quite fundamental problem in the way we regulate drugs. And you can make a lot of criticisms of the FDA, and I've done it, right? The FDA is slow and bureaucratic, but these things can actually, in principle, these things can be fixed. You can imagine a Food and Drug Administration run by AGI agents that are hyper competent and they have minimal human oversight and they optimize for maximal efficiency. Even today, without any AGI, for those of you who have interacted with the FDA before, I'm sure you have varied stories. I've heard quite different opinions about all this, but my perspective on the FDA as a regulator is that it's not that bad compared to other regulators in the United States. It sucks, right? But I promise you it can be worse. We have all kinds of regulatory problems in America. I would say of the various regulators, the FDA tends to be more on the ball, again, compared to other regulators in terms of adapting to novel technologies. For example, the FDA last year created this platform technology designation, which was intended to ease approval pathways for shared components of drug platforms like the nanolipids and mRNA-based therapeutics and things like this, right? That's all good. That's great. I love it. But at the end of the day, those are nips and tucks. And I don't really want to talk about nips and tucks. I would instead submit to you that no matter how many nips and tucks we make, no matter how efficiently we make them, we would still suffer from a fundamental problem in drug regulation. And that's essentially because the FDA is a manifestation of a 20th century industrial era nation state mindset. Big centralized authorities with one size fits all or one size fits most policies. The current incarnation of the FDA dates back to 1962. The FDA has been around for longer, but the current sort of statutory framework that it operates under, it started to resemble its modern statutory form in 62. That was 9 years after the discovery of the DNA helix by Watson and Crick. To the extent we thought about genomes at all at that time, we thought of them as the sort of code of life or whatever. We had these sort of that's a view that persisted in some senses. It still persists today. But it's a very naive view compared to what modern science understands. We now know that isn't true. we thought of diseases as these singular things, right? There's such a thing as cancer. There's such a thing as breast cancer, or there's such a thing as Alzheimer's, right? And they're phenomena that manifest themselves in essentially the same way across the human body and therefore are subject to the same kinds of treatments. That's a fundamental assumption about nature that is embedded into our regulatory structure. And it's an assumption that we increasingly are finding with so many important categories of disease is not quite true. So I would submit that no nips and tucks can possibly fix this problem, because it's just the direction that we are clearly headed in is one in which, first of all, therapeutics are far more personalized. It's also one in which we are curing conditions that have very difficult to validate clinical endpoints, right? So if we're talking about aging, if we're talking about like longevity drugs, the clinical endpoints for that, yes, you can do, there's, I'm thinking of the meme with the gymnastics and the the rocket ship and all the complicated steps you can go through. Yes, you could cram it in, right? Like accelerated approval pathway based on some sort of clinical and make up and decide is an indicator of aging. But like when Dario Amodei says in 5 years we'll have extended human lifespans by 50% or whatever he says, I'm like, well, you won't know that. You'll have no way of knowing that because no one will have lived to be 150 in 5 years from now, by definition. We might think we might have good principled reason to believe that we have, but we won't know. And so, and then also, I think there's going to be other aspects of biotechnological innovation that just really fundamentally challenge us in terms of ethics and morals and things like this, where as biology becomes increasingly mutable under the hand of humans, there will just be so many questions there that I think on one level, you can make the case that there might be certain things that we want to just straight up outlaw. Fine, Congress has the prerogative to do that. State legislatures are sovereigns and they have the prerogative to do that. But I struggle with the idea that the FDA, with its kind of technocratic mindset, is the right locus for those kinds of like profound moral, ethical, and philosophical questions. And so I look at all these things that I think are coming, and I don't know on what timeline they're coming, but I think they are coming. To some extent, they're already here. And I conclude that my goal is not ultimately reform. My goal is not incremental improvement. I think my goal is to reimagine the institutions of government from soup to nuts. And I view this as a fun case study. I view that the FDA as a great case study for a broader reimagination of our institutions of government that I think AI will require us to make. And so when thinking about that, I think that there are fundamental lessons that we've learned in science and also, frankly, from deep learning that I think can actually inform public policy in quite profound ways. We've learned things, for example, about complex systems. We've learned that the way that almost every complex system in nature works is not because there's a lot of really complicated deterministic rules. It's instead all based on simple rules. It's these complex systems that are emergent from simple rules. And I think that the direction that we have to head is toward institutions that are shaped by that understanding of nature, as opposed to trying to control nature and reality from the top down with our kind of deterministic, simple-minded simian rules. No matter how many words we use, I think they'll continue to be rather mongoloid. And, I'm reminded of a quote from Darwin that I'm sure you've all heard before. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I was in the rainforest recently for my honeymoon, and I thought about that quote a lot. you're looking at a system that emerged from very simple rules and all of this beauty and wonder and complexity. But it's also not beautiful or wonderful for many of the participants in that ecosystem, right? Like it sucks oftentimes. It's a quite brutal, like it makes free market capitalism look like a Marxist utopia. Like it is a brutal competitive environment. So I think we can afford to be, nature has very limited affordances, and we can afford to be softer than evolution. I do not propose a Darwinian approach to all of this, but I guess the way I think about this is, first of all, just because a rule is old does not mean that it's bad. There's a lot of wisdom in old and simple rules. And so I find myself actually looking to the past very frequently when I think about reimagining our institutions of government. I find myself looking to what are the first rules that we stumbled on? What are the ones that we found that, because those are maybe the ones that are the closest to like optimal in some sense, if you can find commonalities in particular across different civilizations. And I'm inspired by the fact that one of the most forward-looking Supreme Court decisions of all time, in my opinion, the Supreme Court decision that allowed for life to be patented, GMOs to be patented, was based on a law written in the 1790s by Thomas Jefferson. And I will quote it. I will quote the statute in its entirety, because it's a statute I can quote in its entirety, which is rare for the statutes we write today. But it is 35 United States Code, Section 101, Inventions Patentable. This is back when our language still was influenced by French. And so the adjective is on the other side. Whoever invents or discovers any new and useful process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any new and useful improvement thereof, may obtain a patent therefore, subject to the conditions and requirements of this title. That's it, right? That's the headline of, that's how you define eligibility for a patent. And so the question was, are modified forms of life compositions of matter? And the answer was yes. And so a statute from the 1790s worked just fine. So I think that there's often a presumption when you say, oh, this thing is old, that means it doesn't work anymore. But I think that's actually quite wrong. I think old things that are simple with lots of wisdom embedded in them can be a source of great richness. Furthermore, I think that in a republic, which it's conceivable that not everyone I'm talking to right now lives in the United States, but I am primarily think about American policy. And America is a constitutional republic. And what does republic mean? It means res publica, the public thing is what that means. Part of the idea of a republic is that the laws should be simple, elegant, and intuitive. It's the foundation, I think, really, of a healthy republic. You shouldn't have to think that much about the law as a citizen. The law should be intuitive. It should be like, yeah, the government's going to get involved when like something like this happens. And it's like actually pretty intuitive. By contrast, though, republics can historically decline from this kind of a standard. In the Roman Empire, but there was still Republican dressing in Rome at the time, Caligula is said to, I think this is true, but I've heard some stories that it's apocryphal. He was said to have placed the laws in really small text at the top of high columns so that no one could actually read it. And so everyone was ostensibly aware of the law because, look, it's right there. I can point at it, but no one knew what the laws were. And I feel as though that's the world we live in today. There's all these dense thickets of technocratic rules. There's undoubtedly in drug regulation, this is the case. They're promulgated, disclosed, you're notified, right? You can go look on it's all very transparent, but they're incomprehensible. Truthfully, not even the government understands the rules. A favorite anecdote of mine is that in the Obama administration, the Library of Congress was asked to document how many laws there were in America. Just say a number, how many laws. And the Library of Congress spent more than a year on that task. And they concluded that it was impossible to say how many laws there were. Make no mistake, the world that you live in is closer to the Roman Empire under Caligula than it is to the republic that was envisioned by our founders. And so I also think of the project that I'm embarked on as a restorative project, right? A great a great final quote from actually one of my favorite writers about the FDA, who unfortunately died a few years ago, a gentleman by the name of Peter Huber, said this. He said, "Law reflects, but in no sense determines, the moral worth of a society. The better the society, the less law there will be. The worse the society, the more law there will be. In hell, there will be nothing but law, and due process will be meticulously observed." And I think anyone here who has encountered the regulatory system or the court system might well resonate with that. So how do we fix this in the context of biotechnology? I think, keeping with the theme of what I said so far, I look back at the old for inspiration. How were commercial relationships governed before the high industrial era, the kind of modern nation state? Up until in the United States about the 1950s, around the same time that the FDA came into place, the way that this basically worked is there was a contract. You would sign a contract with whomever you were purchasing services from, and that contract would say, here's what I'm going to give you. Here's what we expect it to do. If something goes wrong with it, here are the remedies we will have. And if you mess up as the buyer in some way, here are the remedies. And yeah, if you get harmed, here's the ways that you'll be compensated, et cetera, et cetera. That system of contract was thrown out as part of what I view as this modern technocratic nation state project. It was thrown out between the 50s and the early 70s in favor of much greater reliance on something called tort liability. Now, in the case of the FDA, in the case of drugs, there's just statutory law where it's like, you're regulated by the FDA and there's clinical trials. But there's also one of the great ironies is that drug companies also face tort liability, which is you adhered to all the laws. The FDA said your drug was safe, but your vaccine ostensibly caused XYZ harm in some patients, and we can sue you. We can sue you in civil court for that. We can sue the vaccine maker. And the result of that system was that most of the vaccine makers left America, is the result of the system. And we had a significant decline in the number of vaccine producers and new vaccines in the country, because it was essentially, this is still true today, it's essentially illegal to offer a vaccine in America unless you have special protections. You need to be given special protections from the tort liability. I think that there's just no way that this system will continue to work. The tort thing is not going to work, and I think the FDA thing is not going to work. But I think contracts can. And I think, imagine this. Imagine if, instead of regulating drugs, the FDA regulated entities. They regulated pharmaceutical companies and said, we're going to look at your practices. We're going to look at how you manufacture things. We're going to look at like your research practices and assess the underlying science. And then we're going to give you a license. And that license will permit you to engage in contracts with compliant, agreeing parties, someone like me, who wants to experiment with a drug. And that contract will specify what happens if the drug doesn't work, or what happens if the drug harms you in some way. And we leave that to be, in some sense, negotiated as a relationship between the patient and the provider of the pharmaceutical. Now, of course, in this world, the FDA or Congress, they can set parameters around those contracts. They can say, for example, there has to be a minimum of $5 million of harms taken care of if the drug hurts you in some way, right? Something like that, right? Congress can do all sorts of things like this. But that, to me, allows for far greater optionality. Because that way, if I want a drug that maybe is going to make my kids smarter or something, that's a contract that I, as the parent of my child, I can engage in that contract. I can negotiate the terms of that contract. I can perhaps negotiate it with an AI lawyer who's smarter than any lawyers who's ever lawyered. And if something goes wrong, I will have a guarantee of compensation. As opposed to in the current system where if something goes wrong, you're either SOL because the FDA indemnified the company in some way, which happens for certain kinds of drugs, or you basically just can't get anything, which is immoral, right? It's totally immoral that the FDA said, yeah, we're going to give you safe harbor from all this liability, even for the people that have legitimate harms. Or I go into the tort liability system, which is a casino. Most tort cases fail. So my child dies from a drug and I want to sue the company that sold me the drug. In the current world today, I don't have a guarantee of compensation. In fact, the odds are against me. And so when people tell me that a contract-based system is somehow less moral because it's based on personal responsibility and it puts more of the burden on the individual transacting parties instead of socializing that burden, my reaction to that is I think that the current system is profoundly immoral. The current system is the one that makes it hard, makes it so that only the wealthy and people with wherewithal can receive compensation for harms that happen. And even the wealthy have to go through this casino where they're likely to fail. And of course, it's a for-profit industry where the lawyer who represents you gets a cut of your money. And so the lawyer who represents you has all these incentives that aren't necessarily your own incentives. I see it as much more logical of if something goes wrong, here's a guaranteed amount of money that you're going to get paid the next business day, right? And what do we have courts for? Courts enforce contracts. That's the way the world worked for a really long time. None of the people, I don't know. I can't tell. There might be some people here who were alive before the mid-1960s, but very few of the people on this call were likely alive when this is the way the world worked. But your parents were. Your parents quite possibly lived much of their lives under a system that basically worked this way. And should it work this way for everything? No. And was the old system broken and harsh and cruel in ways that I don't have time to go into? But yes, it was. Can we afford, as a rich society, something more luxurious with more protections for people? We totally can. But I see this as being the far better approach, because I could come on this talk and I could talk to you about, again, like accelerated approval pathways with like weird mid-stage endpoints for longevity or whatever. But I don't really think that solves the fundamental problem. I think the fundamental problem nowadays is that the relationship between your ability to modify your own biology is going to increase so substantially that I just think there's absolutely no way we can delegate responsibility for those decisions to this blob. Oh, it's democratic. Oh, it's democratic because we have a law that says the FDA does it. I dispute that. I think the democratic way to do this is for the individual to decide what's worth it for them and what isn't, rather than all of society deciding. There are exceptions to that. There might be things where we're like, you know what? No, you can't make your kids smarter. I think that would be immoral, but I could see a state passing that law or the Congress passing that law or whatever. But in my view, this is a system that ends up with far more richness of experience and innovation and all that stuff. And I think it's also a more moral and ethical world. So from where I see it, I'm old-fashioned. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the foundation of our republic. Our republic is based on simple rules for a complex world, and my objective is to restore that. That's all I got for you. Happy to answer any questions.
Love it. That was peppered with historical anecdotes, some crazy facts about laws that I had no idea about, and some, I think, pretty good and generalist advice that not only apply to biotech, but to some other areas as well that people here care about. Okay, we have a lot of 2 hand raises already. So again, a reminder for you guys, if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or to drop it in the chat if you can't ask the question yourself, because then I can ask it for you. John, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, it sounds a bit odd, but I think you also need to think about big pharma, because big pharma isn't necessarily big pharma. It can be small pharma. It can be the other side of the contract. Mm-hmm. The basic danger with pharmaceuticals is, on a net basis, the amount of money that goes in for any particular drug, on average, has to be the amount of money that goes out. if you are saying to a pharma company, however big it may be, that you have a liability of, say, $10 million with no safe harbor for this experimental drug, for each person you provide it to, put aside all the research costs, what's the cost of insuring that liability so you can actually pay it next business day? And I think, you see, this is where we talk about safe harbor. The problem is it has to balance out, whether it balances out with society as a whole, which it wouldn't do in America, it might do in England. Wherever it balances, you've got a really big problem if you are going to create a next business day liability of if it's $50, nobody cares. If you're saying your child's died on this experimental drug to try and deal with mitochondrial problems, and I therefore want $1 million, where's that money coming from? Because you're not going to get that money from when you paid for the drug. It's got to come from somewhere.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's exactly right. First of all, yes, I think something like this would have to work in concert with robust insurance. One of the unfortunate things we did with the tort liability system is that we killed innovation in insurance.
If you don't mind me saying, just coming back on this, robust insurance means paying a premium.
Yes.
And when you insure with a company, there's a burning cost. That is, that they add extra for the cost of claims. So in other words, when you pay insurance on a net basis of all the premiums paid, there has to be more money than all the insurance payments out. So whatever that is, it's an additional cost to add to the drug. So if you're not going to have a safe harbor drug, it will have to have all the insurance cost for everybody, the burning cost, and extra broker costs and extra reinsurance costs.
Yeah, so I think what you actually need, I would say that the system I'm thinking of is primarily designed for either individually personalized medicines or like more specific, like tailored therapeutics. I think that if you're talking in the context of something like a vaccine, you do, frankly, I don't know, it's hard to say. Like, I would actually come to the conclusion that, like, I haven't modeled this financially, but I know people have done models for previous vaccines. And the counterfactual where we had a contract system that it was like pretty generous terms, health expenses plus like a guarantee of $1 million for death or something like that. There are previous vaccines where the adverse outcomes are such tail events that it's actually significantly less expensive than the tort system, which drove the vaccine companies out of business, because the tort judgments can be like, when you win, it's like a casino, because when you win in tort, you win big, right? Like, there's a dude in California who was spraying herbicide as part of his job as a groundskeeper at a public school, and the spray tube broke and the herbicide got on his body. And 9 months later, he got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's no demonstrated scientific connection between this herbicide and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he got $300 million. Contractual terms of that kind are not going to work, but no one would agree to that. No company would agree to that contract. Price the risk is the point. Price the risk. And I think a society that has the ability to price risk in robust ways that's a reflection on that society's morality. And so I think one of the problems that you have when you socialize risk and make it unpredictable in the way that we currently do is it's either like totally unpredictable or it's zero. Those are not good moral binaries in my view.
Awesome. Thank you. John, you go ahead.
Hi, that was a
John
very
got the other
interesting,
one. Sorry.
very
Sorry, yeah,
interesting-
John Ferber it is.
Yeah.
John and John. Hi, John Hemming. Okay, that was a very interesting presentation, and I'm not sure because I think the FDA provides a couple of very essential services, overseeing preclinical and clinical trials, which individual purchasers or users of drugs couldn't possibly do. And then whether or not you have clinical trials, there's also the issue of in production, whether the products are tested for purity, even if we don't test them for effectiveness, the FDA can enforce a company that's producing impure or fake products.
Yeah.
How do we get around that?
Yeah, great question. The way I think about this would be almost along the lines of, again, for personalized medicines and things like longevity or like, this didn't go through FDA clinical trials, but there's that probiotic Lumina thing you can take that like you brush your teeth with it and it ostensibly gets rid of dental cavities or whatever. I don't know if that's true. I've not taken Lumina. I've not looked deeply into the science of that. But there's all these different kinds of things where, it's not necessarily curing a disease. It's actually making you actively healthier, where clinical endpoints can be hard to establish. And it's like there's at least a reasonable chance of upside and a lot of chance of, and some maybe small chance of downside.
What about the purity issue? We're actually doing what they claim they're providing.
Yes, I will get to that. The way that I propose something like this work is that it's not that I don't propose doing away with the FDA. Instead, I propose making them almost more something like a meta regulator, where they regulate entities as opposed to products. So instead of regulating at the drug level, you regulate at the level of the entity which produces the drug. And you examine that entity's practices in terms of manufacturing, in terms of research and development, and you certify confidence in that institution as opposed to in the product of that institution. This is similar in some ways to the way that we regulate banks in America, because the idea behind a bank is that a bank is providing an ongoing service, and that if a pharmaceutical company messes up a batch of a drug, that's bad, and that company is going to be in trouble in 1,000 different ways. But if I took a different batch of the drug that was fine, I'm fine, right? Whereas if a bank screws up, everyone's in trouble, right? Every customer of that bank is in trouble. So we have this concept of like macro-prudential regulation in financial services. And I think that, again, this is not true of the world today, where we still make a lot of drugs that are like relatively appropriate for clinical trials, but also clinical trials like the only way to make a drug. So we're getting what we ask for, right? We're asking the market to produce a certain thing with regulation, and the market is producing that thing. And I think there's all kinds of perverse incentives that the clinical trial system creates, particularly as it gets more expensive. And my guess is that the combination of getting rid of that and technological advances, which I expect, but which are speculative, we would be able to move away from this and get to something that's much better, in my opinion.
Great. You have two more hands here. We have Micah and then Mike.
Do you believe that people who understand and acknowledge the risks should be allowed to take on the risk themselves by waiving the right to compensation for harm?
Yeah, sure. Right. Sure. If they really wanted to, and they wanted to if it was like, I want to get the drug much cheaper and I'll just go on my own, we might at some point say, but you would have to agree to that in a contract that prevents you from then going and suing them if something goes wrong. Yeah, if you're totally willing to do that, I think that would be a tough sell for a lot of people in Congress. And so I can imagine that being like a parameter that is fixed in law that prevents such a thing. But if you're asking me personally what I think is morally and ethically okay, I'm personally fine with that.
Yeah, I think the follow-up question to that is, of course, what happens if the pharma companies just start writing that into the contract and say you either take it or leave it, and then people lose all liability.
And this
but
is
both
what
sides
happened.
obviously have advantages.
Yes, and this is what happened. This is why Contract died in the 60s. It didn't die for bad reasons. The people who killed Contract were not bad people. They were reacting to a legitimate problem, which is that every contracts were designed for a world of, they originated in a world of one-to-one business transactions, right? So I buy some service from an individual, and it's all highly bespoke and customized because all businesses were small, in the 17th century. The contract started to strain in a world where, and started to be quite cruel and vicious. I mentioned this earlier. I mentioned in passing that contract was like this very bleak system by the end. Obviously, we still have contracts for lots of things. Not like contracts gone away, but as the primary system for like commercial relationships, it didn't withstand very well mass market, mass produced consumer goods. Because what happened was mass produced consumer goods were sold with a contract of, we disclaim all liability for everything. It's actually, if this world sounds immoral to you today, though, I would just submit that your use of every piece of software you have ever used in your life is governed by a contract that says that says the people who made that contract disclaim all liability. OpenAI says that. If you want to use, right now, the current default path that we are on is one in which a lawnmower is sold to you with terms that are far more favorable to you than super intelligence. And you will sign a contract to use super intelligent. It won't be called a contract. It'll be called an end user license agreement. And that end user license agreement will say OpenAI takes no responsibility for anything that goes wrong. Now, what happened in court in the 50s is that, in the 60s rather, is those contracts were thrown out. It's not like that went away with the law. Courts were just like, no, you can't disclaim liability. Sorry. And they just appended multiple hundred years of precedent when they did that. But that's what they did. I do think it's 100% correct that, again, I'm comfortable with that being something that a person can explicitly opt into. But I do think that you need minimum standards for what contracts would look like, contracts would standardize in this world. And by the way, let me also just say that with more guaranteed financial liabilities for risks, especially tail risks from your, from whatever business you're doing, whether it's, from like for a pharmaceutical company, once those risks are on the balance sheet, all of a sudden this becomes like a New York City fund finance problem, and you can make all kinds of derivatives and create like trillions of dollars of wealth. Now, some of you might like that idea, some of you might not, but it's like literally free money that's just sitting there that we could have if we wanted to, but we don't. Because it's really hard to do this when the risks are super unpredictable, or when the risks are canceled out through a Soviet-style system of safe harbor or limits on how big the damages can be, right? Those things are all nips and tucks on the fundamental problems with tort liability for like normal commercial relations, which it was never intended for. Tort liability is for, I punch you in the face and you're a famous person. And so like, in addition to me having committed a criminal penalty, I also damaged your reputation and you had to get medical bills. And how do you get compensated for the damage I did? That's what tort's about. Tort's not supposed to be about commercial relationships. Tort means wrong. It doesn't mean bad lawnmower design. And I think it's a fundamental, it's a path we went down in this country and elsewhere. And it's not a path that we necessarily need to remain on.
Cool. Do you ever come back to that?
No,
Okay, we can circle.
Mike can go first.
Okay, cool. We might circle back. We might still have time. Mike, hi, good to see you again.
How are you? Thank you so much for focusing on this issue. It's pretty clear. It's the highest leverage approach to reducing suffering and advancing all therapies. So it's very weird to me it's so neglected. But yeah, so I was thinking about ways in which your vision would be materialized. And I was wondering what you think the chances are legally and politically of persuading the government to use a small percentage of the $50 billion a year NIH and FDA budget to upgrade FDA.gov to be like an Amazon for decentralized clinical trials, where patients could enter their condition and see a list of treatments ranked by comparative effectiveness based on the universe of clinical and real world evidence and outcome labels with a list of average positive and negative effects, and then join the trial and make a deposit to be refunded after providing follow-up data, and then participate remotely, continually improving the comprehensive safety and effectiveness rankings in an ongoing basis. And then the trial sponsors would be like sellers on the marketplace. And when you created a trial, then I'm wondering if it would be legal for them to see a list of quotes for liability insurance that they could potentially include in a per participant cost and potentially charge patients for joining the trial. And if we had a system like this where there's FDA was a marketplace combined with this data collection, then could it potentially make phase 2 through 4 approval kind of irrelevant if everybody could just like access treatments immediately? It seems to go around. There's lots of arguments against right to try because these treatments are untested. We can't let people try things. But it seems like you could just bypass all of those arguments by changing it to right to trial instead and say, this is exactly what we're trying to do. And also, if some system like this was implemented, do you think it could achieve the efficiency of the Oxford recovery pragmatic trial design, where the cost per patient was like $500 versus $48,000 in standard trials? So it's like an 80x reduction. And is this crazy? And if it's not crazy, why is there little effort to focusing on like high leverage solutions like this as opposed to individual interventions in terms of the overall biomedical?
It's great. I love it. It's a 0 to 1 question, and there's a lot there. And I agree. Like, I think about this a lot. Like, how do you, it's like it's like an interesting idea. Maybe it's impractical. Maybe you hate it. Maybe you don't. But if you were interested in trying to get there, like, how would you? I'm reminded of how there's like Netflix, when it sold DVDs to you, right? There was a time when what Netflix did was they shipped DVDs to people. And this history of, they realized the internet was going to be this thing. And they're like, okay, we have to transition our business to streaming. But that's like a completely different business, right? Like every single thing about that, like all the assumptions are different. How do we do that? And what they basically did was it's like a great business school case study of how they created a new institution inside of the old one. And then they just they realized it was the thing that was going to grow. And then they just let it grow. And that's how I think about a lot of these emerging technologies that we're like bullish on. Is the ones we're especially bullish on is create regulatory sandboxes for things like that seem very compelling and seem like they're going to grow a lot. And you don't necessarily ever have to write a law where you say the old system's gone. What you instead say is we're going to have these new rules for these new things. And then you just let those things grow.
Do you think that's possible through regulatory guidance by the HHS, or it requires an executive order or congressional legislation?
We in the Trump administration, a lot of things seem possible with executive orders. I don't know. Maybe I'm not that clever of a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer at all, but I'm not that clever about this sort of thing. But I would guess you would need statutory for this. You would need some sort of statutory authorization, but it's like you're not asking for reform. You're asking for, we want a regulatory sandbox for blah, 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 blah. I think longevity drugs are a really interesting example here. And by the way, the whole contract thing is like a pretty high dimensional possibility space. A contract system can 100% sit alongside a mandatory phase 1 clinical trial system. So the FDA might want to be like, yeah, we're going to certify that your company, that we like trust you as a company. And we're also going to make you go through phase 1. We're going to make you go through this doesn't kill people type of thing. And then after that, the contract system obtains, right? I do think that longevity is a really interesting area to play around with here. Probably there's others too, and you guys maybe have better insights about that. But for me, it seems, okay, longevity is good because it's like very difficult clinical endpoint. Maybe those therapeutics are not going to be tailored to the specific patient. They could be conceivably, but that's not my understanding of what like most people are working on in the space. But could you have a longevity system where, yeah, you're going to go through phase 1, we're going to verify that the thing is safe, and then transacting parties can go through an FDA mediated system and have liability and all that kind of thing. I think that makes sense to me. So I think it's an opportunity. And like, in terms of some of the other specifics on your idea, I don't know how feasible that is under existing authorities, but we should talk after this.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, we're in the second round of follow-ups. Micah.
You spoke about how laws used to be simple, and that was generally a good thing, and they've gotten more complicated. That's a bad thing, is the impression I got. It seems like it would be far simpler to just have contract law and not regulate the pharmaceutical companies, just like every other industry. Can you explain why you think it's worth the mountain of legislation required to regulate the pharma companies versus just not, and just having contract law solve everything?
I think without that, you are going to I think the exact problems we talked about with contract will present themselves. Because by default, I think it's not a good outcome if a company can sell you whatever they want and disclaim all liability for things that go wrong. I think that system did start to break down, and we tried to replace it for good reason. I think we replaced it with the wrong thing. But the contract system, the ice cold contract system that obtained for several hundred years, that originated in a time when our ancestors were eating salted potatoes for all meals of the day. Their lives sucked, and society was poor. They were all dirt poor. The poorest people in the world look rich compared to them. And they look these people were, compared to us, they were dumb and poor. And they didn't have a lot of time for the luxury of treating people well. And the sort of brutal contract reality just was what it was. And I think we can bring the fundamentally good parts about contract back with relatively much simpler rules than what we have today.
And do you think that the simplest way to do that would be through regulating pharma rather than just putting some constraints on contract law?
You could totally do that. You could absolutely do that. But I think that's it scares me politically that the system would fall apart, because there will totally be unscrupulous actors. Yeah, actually, one of the things that initially caused tort law, some of the original cases, 100 years ago, that were the original, the precedent for applying tort law in these kind of at the time, novel scenarios, they were cases involving drugs that were snake oil. Right, basically. And so I think even just for the political viability of the system, you probably want some degree of safeguard, would be my guess. And also because it is legitimately true that it's very hard. Another justification for the FDA and for tort law too is the world is so complicated now that you can't expect, even I, as a guy who works for an organization that's the Latin word for market, even I am not going to be yeah, I expect every consumer to I expect you to make educated, informed decisions about your frontier AI system and your gene therapy and all this stuff. We probably do need some degree of technocratic, public agency that's putting a gold star on stuff and we think this is trustworthy. I think that kind of thing of we think this is trustworthy is a public good that's the markets are not necessarily going to produce on their own.
We unfortunately have to gradually wrap up the questioning here, but I wanted to discuss maybe in the last 3 minutes that remaining, if you could give us an outlook on the next 5 years or something, or how can people in this group try? I know that most people here are in science and tech and are working on in these sorts of problem areas day to day here, but if you left people with a message of this is how things might be impacting your career, and also this is how you as someone working in science and tech could possibly have a contribution to make to a more reasonable policy landscape. And then also please close with how can people find out more about you and your work and what's on your docket?
Yeah, sure. I think that the idea I've just sketched out to you is a relatively nascent thing. And there are many ways that it could be improved, I'm sure. And so I think number one would be help do that, right? The way that you make policy change is by first forming an intellectual community that builds intellectual firmament. So that would be number one. Number two would be the 0 to 1 thing is something that people in the technical side will be much better positioned to make judgments about than I will. What is a good candidate here, right? What's a good thing? And then if you tell me about that, and I'll bang the drum about that in DC and I'll do it for others, right? That's another one. Then finally, I certainly welcome all kinds of criticism. And then in terms of me, I write a Substack called Hyperdimensional. A lot of my stuff is on AI. A lot of this contract stuff that I've been doing actually relates to work that I've been doing on AI liability. And you can find me at Hyperdimensional. Also, if you just Google my name, my website is deanball.com. And I have an email address on there. You can contact me that way. Also, Twitter. I'm very accessible. Yeah.
All right, Twitter DMs are open. That's always a very dangerous thing to say in a public setting, but here you go. Thanks a lot. I hope that you're getting some of the critique that you're asking for, and then also some of the continued collaboration on fleshing out some of these ideas. Thanks a lot for coming on, and thanks everyone for the great points that you're making and discussion around it. I think it's especially right now, it seems like a rapidly emerging space, the policy around longevity, health, and bio. So there might be now no better time than now to actually have a voice and make an impact. But yeah, thanks a lot, Dean. Thanks everyone. We can't wait to see you for the next one. Bye bye.